We're streaming live now. Welcome, everyone. We're in a session called Kanun Ke Haath. We've titled it Kanun Ke Haath. And for the number of drastic legal changes that have come between the two Do Din 2019 and Do Din 2020, we know that these changes have impacted our lives in unforeseen ways. So, in this session, we hope to examine these in the context of the many disruptions brought about by the pandemic and the general democratic decline that we've seen that has marked this period. So, for this session, we have Dr. Siddharth Chauhan, who is assistant professor at Nalsar, Hyderabad. And apart from his teaching responsibilities, he's part of the administrative committees that facilitate the institution's public education initiatives and international exchange programs. He's the faculty advisor for the Nalsar Public Policy Lecture Series that started in September 2015, and the lecture series on constitutionalism that was started in 2016, and the Nalsar Student Law Review ever since the annual year 2017 and 18. Joining him is Manish, a research associate at Center for Policy Research and a graduate of the National Law School of India University, Bangalore. His interests lie at the intersection of legal and regulatory processes with issues of justice, human rights, and constitutional law. His current role in CPR focuses on questions of development, policy, and law in the context of migration, transport, urban planning, livelihood, and gender as lived experiences in the city. So, Kanun ke haath it is. Over to Siddharth and Manish.
Okay, so I thought, if you start recounting all the legislative changes this year, I guess we'll probably need the entire day to talk about them. So it makes more sense just to try and talk about how to look at these changes from a slightly more long-term point of view. And then maybe home in on a couple of examples which we think are very stark, which possibly do call for an immediate public dialogue. So when we were speaking a couple of days ago, we remembered a certain idea that we had discussed earlier in our undergraduate education. I mean, I didn't exactly overlap with Manish, but we were 5 years apart, I think. But there was an overlap later when I returned as a lecturer. So generally, the criticism that we often face in the classroom is that Marxist or neo-Marxist ideas are not going to make you very popular outside of the classroom. And most of the press, of course, doesn't take it seriously. These days, of course, you can face serious consequences, right from disapproving relatives on social media to possibly the police framing you in a case. But the author whose name suddenly popped up in my head was Giorgio Agamben, who talked about how invoking this idea of a state of exception is not simply limited to scenarios where you have a real visible crisis. I mean, obviously, most constitutions in the world do carve out scenarios where governmental powers have to be exercised as a state of exception, be it emergency powers, which is normally supposed to be used theoretically in response to armed conflict or insurgencies, or for that matter, previous instances of the use of centralized power or autocratic powers, especially in contexts like health emergencies or natural disasters. So obviously, since we have not seen a pandemic like this in our living memory, it's something which has occurred possibly after 3 generations. The drafting of the Indian Constitution didn't exactly contemplate a health pandemic as one of the grounds for imposing an emergency, though you do have constitutions in some other parts of the world where grounds connected to public health can in fact be a basis for the use of exceptional power. So the question to ask is that Giorgio Agamben's insights were not limited to how a constitutional text might foresee a sense of possibilities, might foresee exceptional possibilities, but he was more concerned about how we end up codifying and entrenching the exceptional use of power or the state of exception even in day-to-day governance. And I think that theme resonates with us not just in the context of the larger democratic slide which Vanshika just referred to, because there are quite a few scholars working in the field of comparative politics, right, who are obviously documenting instances of how many established electoral democracies seem to be in a period of democratic decline, especially over the last decade. But even irrespective of that, assuming that we did not have all these, macho men or elected autocrats flexing their muscles, or assuming even if we didn't have this pandemic, I think we would still be in this in a situation that raises the kind of anxieties that we are faced with today. So to be completely honest, I mean, if we just try and look at the politics of the last few years, the fact that the lockdown was imposed at 4 hours notice was not really a surprise to most of us, right? I mean, anyone who remembers 8th November 2016, obviously,
Demonetization.
yeah, obviously knows that a certain prime leader has a capacity for Jhatka style decision making, as Raghuram Rajan says it. And those who have been following, like his previous term as Gujarat Chief Minister, of course, know that he's done such things for a long time. So to be honest, you do know that when you elevate people to a certain position, then sometimes their personality trait does have an impact on millions of others. But it's something that we knew could happen. So the fact that the lockdown was announced in the way it was not really so much of a surprise. I guess what took most of us, most of middle class India or most of elite India by surprise was the absolute lack of preparedness for what came after, right? The way in which, of course, we refused to create serious safety nets for the informal sector and the migrant workers who walked back. And I'm sure some of the earlier sessions today have discussed those problems at length. So from the
and I think some of tomorrow's sessions will as well.
Yeah, I'm sure. So I guess the legal side of it begins more directly with the two formal instruments which have been used this year, the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897 and the National Disaster Management Act of 2005. But since we are recording this for a general audience, I guess it makes sense for me to just begin by talking about how both of these statutes were actually direct responses to specific events. The 1897 Act was a response to the bubonic plague, mostly which was limited to Western India at that time because transport links were not as effective, and mostly it was people sailing into Bombay who had carried in the bubonic plague. And you have written records of that time which document the suffering and the excesses which took place. So the Epidemic Diseases Act of 1897, which has been the principal legislative response to this year's situation, is not only 123 years old, but was made in response to a very different kind of problem with a very different set of assumptions about how a disease was likely to spread and what kind of administrative framework would be suitable. The more recent law, which I guess is going to be in force even in the next year or two, I guess. I mean, we're not scientists, so we can't predict how the pandemic will end. But the National Disaster Management Act, if I may remind viewers, was also crafted as a response primarily to a series of disasters which happened in the beginning of the century. So whether it is the cyclone in Orissa of 1999 or the major earthquake in Gujarat, or for that matter, the immediate trigger was the tsunami, which killed thousands of people in Tamil Nadu. So from a domestic point of view, it was essentially these two statutes which were available to us as legal instruments. Some people might argue that the Epidemic Diseases Act was completely ineffective, should have been replaced by now. We should have had a statute to respond to modern day pandemics and so on. But obviously, our legislative response had to be tailored around these two statutes. So the question is that do these two statutes reflect a very specific period of anxiety or a specific crisis that they were responding to? Or do they capture a larger pathology about the exercise of power, right, which permeates the way in which we think about governance and administration in India? So I think that's where I thought Manish can also pick up.
Yeah, absolutely, Siddharth. And I think like we see that at the pandemic has not only brought to the fore serious questions around public health management, but also in relation to governance at large. And I think we saw some of this manifested very starkly during the national lockdown that happened, and with very short notice, and had drastic impacts across the country. As Siddharth has pointed out, the legislative framework that was used to achieve this was essentially not something that was specifically designed for a pandemic in the 21st century, right? And therefore, you saw a situation that also called, it was a situation that ideally for a legislature and for lawmaking apparatus would have called for bipartisan policy making, for enduring investments in public health infrastructure, and a series of informed debates on how best the country should respond to what is a national and a global challenge. Instead, what we saw was political grandstanding. We saw a series of knee-jerk reactions. And I think what Siddharth highlighted about these two legislations was that they're essentially emergency response tools, right? So the entire framework of the government's response was um, as an emergency, as a series of knee-jerk responses, which was the initial of which was to the global panic around the pandemic, and subsequently to a series of crises that were largely of the government's own making. And Suhas Palshikar in the writing in the Indian Express uses a very interesting phrase just the week after the lockdown was imposed. He said, on 24th March, we didn't just suspend we didn't just suspend life, but we suspended politics, right? And I think during that period, the period that followed the extended lockdown, the very centralized and top-down functioning of the Ministry of Home Affairs, which seemed to take on, incidentally, a greater role than the Ministry of Health in this regard, also raised a lot of federal questions about the role of the states in responding to a national crisis. The pandemic, through the imposition of these and other restrictions, also served to muffle debate and silence critical questions of accountability around public response and public finance during this period. Right? So debates that would have ordinarily policy actions that would have ordinarily been subject to legislative debate as well as public debate, such as the relief package announced by the finance minister, or ad hoc and opaque measures like the PM CARES fund, largely passed through without any substantive discussion either in the legislative or in the public realm, right? And whatever discussion was attempted to be had around those areas was largely stifled. And then we saw that following immediately after the lockdown was lifted with a very truncated parliamentary session, not particularly helped by a somewhat lackluster opposition. But then the government's sort of substantive efforts at repressing any sort of parliamentary debate. I think this is one of the shortest parliamentary sessions that we've had in history, despite which there have been very long-term and very substantive legislative changes that have been brought about in this session, right? So you have laws like the farm bills, which are being debated which are being protested against at this very point of time. And in fact, it's interesting because between Dodin 2019, at this time last year, we were in the middle of the anti-CAA protests, right? And 1 year later, we're again in a state of upheaval. There is again mobilization, there is agitation. The one thing that does remain unchanged, I think, is the response of the state and the space for dialogue and engagement with the state, leave alone dissent, appears to be as closed as it was at the same time last year, right? And it's also ironic, I think, that the one symbolic forum for democratic dialogue, Parliament, which was actually functioning last year, and those of us who watched the debate around the CA will remember that the topic was actually discussed in Parliament, subject to a debate where members raised questions and the minister responded. Whatever the final action might have been, there was that democratic dialogue that did happen to whatever extent it did. This year, that option has also been closed, and we all recall the scenes in the Rajya Sabha immediately prior to the passing of the farm legislations. And it's ironic that this is happening at the same time while the government has also, without discussion, considering investing substantial amount of public funding in a new parliament building. I think we can go back to a couple of.
So Manish, I don't think the spending on the parliamentary building, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have strong opinions about it because it symbolizes spending which can otherwise be devoted elsewhere. But I think in the larger scheme of things, I don't think that's the real sort of issue which affects our attitudes towards the law.
Absolutely.
The other point which I thought I didn't bring up, I should have specified, was that apart, of course, from the use of the Epidemic Diseases Act or the National Disaster Management Act to justify these lockdowns, the other instruments which have been used on a day-to-day basis are sections in the Indian Penal Code. And I remember when we did our criminal law courses, I remember doing the criminal law courses in 2004 as a second year undergraduate student. And we didn't even incidentally refer to the sections which
Yeah.
deals with the negligent spread of disease or the malignant spread of disease in section 269, 270, thereabouts.
270, yeah.
And section 188 of the IPC, where basically the police can just arrest you if you seem to be disobeying orders.
And yeah, in fact, I think that's the section on which they've been arresting people for not wearing masks.
Yeah, so in fact, these two sections, the substantive offences under 269 and 270 and the procedural powers under 188 IPC have in fact been used the most. Not just through the lockdown, but also afterwards. And it's very interesting that something which we don't even pay attention to, or we never really paid attention to, at least in living memory, in our ordinary teaching of criminal law or discussions of criminal law, suddenly gained a significance of its own. And I remember it's not simply a question of how the incumbent police might misuse their discretion, but we did hear reports, and in fact, many of us, I'm sure, have direct observations about people who have suffered immensely because of the use of these sections. People
Absolutely.
Who lost livelihoods, people who were beaten up when they were trying to get groceries for their families, and many
I think we saw
have been documented.
Yeah, I think we saw a lot of this, especially during the initial phases of the lockdown when it was at its most stringent. And I also want to mention here the migrant crisis that it engendered at that point of time. The in a way short-sighted application of the lockdown without thought for its consequences.
No, but the use of the criminal law is not linked to the causes of the lockdown. But what I'm trying to say is that the use of the criminal law in a indiscriminate fashion made it much worse.
Absolutely. No, in fact, it was interesting because in the initial days of the lockdown, if you will recall, during the time when we had to get these movement passes to like sort of go around even for the most basic of things. It was and when the governments were trying to help out and belatedly sort of help out migrants with the special trains and all that, it was initially the police station that was the locus of all of this, right? So so where I am right now in Bangalore, for instance, it was the Bangalore City Police that largely played a role in most of the substantive on-ground enforcement, and that is, I think, in similar stories in other states, and that is, I think, also where we saw a lot of the day-to-day violations occur. And I think it centralized, in that sense, the role of the police as the only sort of agency that seemed to have this comprehensive hold on administration, right? It wasn't the public, it wasn't the health departments. In most states, it wasn't the health departments that were at the forefront. It was the police. In fact, even, and I want to sort of digress a little bit here, because it was actually the police who were also doing the initial registrations of the migrants for the special trains and other such things. In fact, in Bangalore, we saw when the trains started to be organized, and which also happened like rather belatedly, we had the police set up these camps, and then you had long queues forming outside police stations, right? Because these migrants were trying to find whatever way they could to go back home. And if I might just add here that it was also reflective of the failure in our existing legal social security mechanisms for the various classes of informal workers who were substantially affected by the lockdown. And just to give sort of one instance of that, the Interstate Migrant Workers Act of 1979 ordinarily requires states to register migrant workers when they move across borders, right? The implementation of this, of course, has been substantially less than satisfactory, and therefore, where the state should have had a ready database of where their labor was and what benefits were being provided to them, instead found themselves staring at empty lists or largely outdated lists. Even in fact, in later legislation, the Building and Construction Workers Act also provides for the registration of construction workers, but it's been so poorly implemented across the country, even like 20 years after its enactment, that many states still don't have accurate lists of beneficiaries. Far fewer workers are registered than the total estimated number, and so on. And I think there was this general sort of failure of the overall social welfare process, despite the existence of laws for that purpose. And I also want to mention here that we did see one of the legislations, or one of the sets of legislation that got passed in this truncated parliament session without an opposition were the new labor codes. And these labor codes sort of make substantial changes to the regulation of the relationship between employers and employees, and in some cases, benefits and working conditions for workers. They did go to the Standing Committee of Parliament, which actually considered the Standing Committee on Labour did consider the impact of the pandemic when it submitted its report. But the final drafts that were actually passed by the Parliament did not really engage with many of the Standing Committee's recommendations. And because there was no opposition in the House, and because in fact these bills were passed without even a discussion on the floor of the House, that subversion of the democratic process at that point of time is something that has long-term implications. And then this reflects again.
Obviously not to kind of disagree with you, but at least with the labor codes, the drafts were out for a fairly long time. They were out for at least a couple of years. And one of the codes had in fact been passed
previously last year. Yeah.
I think if you compare the treatment of the labor codes with the farm bills, there is a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And the farm bills, I think, didn't even go to committee.
Yeah, let me finish the thread. So the farm bills were brought in June as ordinances. And then, of course, in September, we had the entire dramatic exercise in Parliament where the opposition's demand for a voice vote in the Rajya Sabha was not honored. And then you had suspensions of MPs and the bills were passed without debate. So I would differentiate between the way in which the labor laws were passed through and the farm bills were passed through. Of course, in the long run, I think both are examples of trying to dilute the requirements of the legislative process. And much of the discussion, I guess, in the last 10 to 15 years has been actually on how to deepen the legislative process, right? And that's a point I just wanted to pause on, because whether it is civil society efforts or whether it is some legislators trying to cultivate a more media-friendly image, we've actually had a fair amount of attention being paid to the need to make the formal lawmaking process more open to civil society consultations. So whether it is the possibility of asking for comments at the stage a ministry even thinks of a draft, or for that matter, of course, what was being demanded in the context of the farm bills, that they be referred to a standing committee, because in the Indian Parliament, you have a standing committee for each ministry. Yeah. And then the better way to resolve the current issue would have been that the standing committee could have then directly heard from the unions and the affected stakeholders and worked out some compromise. So the fact that the current government saw the pandemic as both a need, both a reason and an opportunity to just disregard all that process and to disregard much of the improvements which have in fact happened in the last couple of decades, I think that's a point which is worth noting.
Absolutely.
The Indian Parliament has not had a standing committee system since the 50s. The standing committee system was created in 1993 during Narasimha Rao's tenure. And we, in fact, have had very good positive contributions to legislative debate by way of the standing committee system in the last generation. So to use this scenario to say that the country requires more economic investment or the country requires radical changes in the agricultural markets or the labor markets, and to do it in this form, I think itself is what most people should take exception to. So obviously, neither of us are trained to talk about the merits of the farm bills. I don't think we understand the issues well enough. But from a formalist legal perspective, I guess the deliberate disregard of the parliamentary process is something that people should be concerned about. I mean, irrespective of which party you support or even if you don't vote, I think it's the denial of process which is what should be really the main point we should try and address.
Absolutely. I think on the note of sort of pushing reforms by stealth and without debate, I also want to touch on one more point, which is the central government stipulations earlier this year. This also comes back to impacts on the federal structure. Earlier this year, the central government permitted state governments to sort of borrow beyond the norm that is permitted under fiscal responsibility legislation. So state governments by law are only permitted to borrow beyond up to a certain % of the state's GDP. And similarly, the central government has restrictions on borrowing. This is for overall fiscal responsibility of the states. And one of the things that the central government said was that the states could borrow up to 2% more than their limits if they were to implement certain reforms. And these reforms included electricity reform with direct benefit transfers. It included implementing reforms in the food security system. A bunch of things that were actually substantially within legislatively and executively within the state's domain to carry out. But the central government sort of used it as an opportunity to push the states to carry out further reforms. We've also seen, and I think neither Siddharth nor I will be able to talk too much about the details of it. But we also saw the GST crisis that happened when there was a revenue shortfall on account of the economic disruption caused by the pandemic. And then the center wanted the states to take the burden of that shortfall, even though the argument was made that the center was legally obliged to pay that amount of money to the state. So there has been, I think, a certain attempt at centralizing and this is an ongoing attempt. I think it's not new. But the pandemic has, with all other things, provided sort of adequate cover for these kind of things to take place.
Yeah, I mean, just a couple of things on the GST shortfall issue. I mean, like you said, probably people with expertise in political economy or tax law can explain this better. But I guess the central dispute was that the GST Act itself had undergone some amendments, where the tax shortfall, because states were essentially giving up their power to tax certain products.
Yeah.
And in the centralized levies which were created with the GST Act, the states were meant to be compensated for at least a 5-year period. That is till 2022. And this year, I think it's not just the fact of the pandemic, but the slowdown over the last couple of years, which led to a situation where the central government had not released the payments for the reimbursements for a quarter or so. So that's where we saw the finance ministers from the opposition states, especially Punjab and Kerala, basically raising the issue publicly. And the solutions, of course, have not really been satisfactory. I mean, they claim that they've worked out some solutions in terms of who to take loans from or what adjustments to make. But my own estimation is that kind of issue would have arisen irrespective of the pandemic. Because the failure to repay the GST reimbursement had actually started much before the pandemic. Yeah. But just to
I think it was a pandemic that enabled them to sort of get away with it, because it was a situation where it was portrayed that the center was also sort of
let's
acting at its limits. And
I think that example is not really within our expertise, but at least the impression I'm forming is very different from. But I guess the central point which we wanted just to come back to was that whether it was the use of administrative discretion to respond to what was considered to be an exceptional once in 3 generations type situation, or whether it was the deliberate or I guess the behavioral neglect of legislative institutions. It's not that these ideas themselves are appearing for the first time, which is why I wanted to start with that thread on the state of exception becoming the state of norm. Because you can find numerous examples going back in the past. I mean, whether it is the internal emergency of the 70s, or for that matter, insurgency hit areas, you have had scenarios where similar processes have been at play at different points of time. And these days, of course, you have the popular WhatsApp forward version of history, where every injustice in the present can be justified by referring to another injustice in the past. Almost as if, perpetrating a wrong today is justified because there were other wrongs in the past.
Absolutely.
Which is, of course, like a very Amar Chitrakatha style of writing histories. But if we can think maybe a little bit beyond that way of rationalizing what stance should be taken for the present and the future, I guess the proper way to think about this is that given the fact that the absence of safety nets has been so visibly exposed, both not just in the domestic press, but also in the international press, given that the fact that the country has suffered so much economically, I mean, even in comparison to countries with similar socioeconomic indicators, India's growth rates have really have plummeted this year. I think they're amongst the worst, even in comparison to our immediate neighbors. So how do we then locate the use of law to respond to such situations? It's not just a question of which legal instruments are going to be useful in the recovery. I mean, everybody knows that the vaccine distribution is obviously going to be a large act of administrative discretion. I don't think any statute is going to come into play, though of course there will be questions such as who are the priority groups and what is the level of the expertise of the decision makers in deciding who gets priority in the vaccine. I think that's just a sort of question which was bound to come up. But I guess the larger question would be, what is our level of legislative or administrative preparedness for such crises in the future? And there is no guarantee that we are going to get away from single party rule or single party majoritarianism, at least for the next generation. I mean, at the moment, it has one form. In another 10 years, it might take another form. My good friend Shivam Vij thinks they'll be in power till 2049. So I think the cycles of electoral power are not really the main issue that we can do something about. But the question to ask is, what kind of changes do we envision to, let's say, a law like the Epidemic Diseases Act? I mean, I guess that should be one priority for legislative change. But on the larger theme of this pandemic being used as an opportunity to pass through legislations which otherwise benefit some stakeholders or which are being done at the behest of crony capitalists, I think that's a very messy conversation. It's not.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think one final, since we're nearing the end of our sort of time, I just want to add one more element to this discussion, which is, I think, the role of how institutions have endured during the pandemic. And I think, I mean, in constitutional sort of discussions, we speak a lot about the separation of powers and checks and balances that institutions have on each other. And obviously, all of this is premised on institutions being able to function effectively. One thing that this pandemic did, I think, was that it also impacted the functioning of the judicial system. So, like, you had courts closed for long periods of time. Then you had several courts. In fact, even today, several courts functioning only with virtual hearings, which work for some cases, but still have their own sort of issues of access. You had issues of people in prisons not being able to meet their lawyers and things like that. And then, of course, you had the more sort of egregious sort of situations in places like Kashmir, where we still have a partial internet shutdown in many parts of the state, right? And the ability of people to sort of access justice there. I think we've seen. I think for me, one of the heartening signs in the recent months, as we have recovered from the initial shutdown, has been watching the trial courts in many places and the high courts in a few other places sort of step up a little bit to the game. I think I mean whether it's an adequate response or not, I think is I think it's still open. But you've seen, for instance, dozens and dozens of people who were sort of from the Tablighi Jamaat who were who've been getting acquitted and discharged and so on, right? In recent times, even in, for instance, the Delhi riots cases, which started earlier this year, and people were sort of stuck in jail for a long time because courts were closed. Even there, except for the more egregious UAPA cases where the courts are procedurally tied, you've seen courts being starting to give bail to accused, starting to let off people, and actually sort of perform their core function of sort of acting as a check on unjust exercise of police power. And I think for that for me has been a small silver lining, if one might add.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to be charitable.
Yeah, I think Siddharth, you have a more cynical position on this.
Yeah, I mean, you're being charitable about the courts because, to be honest, if the transition to online hearings seems to be working well for lawyers sitting in the state high courts and the elite bar in Delhi, there's no reason why they couldn't have done it quickly enough. I mean, I have personal friends who appear in Delhi in different forums who've said that the shock in terms of livelihoods lost is quite a lot. And we're just talking about the lawyers who are losing their source of income. Think about the downstream effect on clients or litigants whose cases await adjudication. So even if we move away from what the media might be concentrating on, or at least the few independent media outlets that we have, even as a routine, in terms of what the routine impact of the lockdown has been, a question to ask is that the transition to online hearings should not have been so cumbersome.
Yeah,
It took the Indian
absolutely.
Supreme Court a good 4 months before they started, before all the benches started sitting in virtual hearings.
Yeah,
So what
and
was
even then,
what was
even
preventing
then,
them?
in the initial days, like I think they had software glitches, major software glitches
Oh, I
and
mean,
stuff.
that's fine. I mean, that even for example, if you're running our classes online, I mean, despite being a small or selective school, we had our problems also. But you get accustomed to the technology. But when you're performing an important function like justice delivery, whether at the trial level, the appellate level, or at the constitution bench level, a disruption of 4 months is a big deal.
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
just in terms of private disputes getting postponed or important matters not being listed or heard, which is anyway a criticism of our top courts. So I think the idea that you're looking for a few bright spots here and there because some independent high court judge gave bail. I mean, let's put it in perspective.
No, absolutely,
Let's not get
absolutely.
carried away. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and I think an important sort of criticism in the Supreme Court is that, like, I think over the year, basically constitutional adjudication has largely come to a halt. Like all important matters of constitutional importance have been on hold. Like there is,
This year or the last 3 years?
yeah, that also.
I mean, you
I think
haven't.
last year we had a beginning when the constitution benches
No, I
started
think our
functioning.
good friend Gautam Bhati has captured it very well in his blogs.
Yeah.
People now call him the new angry young man of Delhi. But I mean, the electoral bonds case, remember, has not been heard on
Yes,
merit.
yes, absolutely,
The CA
absolutely.
reorganization case, there's no mention of it even being heard, even though it has serious implications for Indian federalism.
Yeah.
The CA matter, of course, the government has not enforced administrative rules. So that's being kicked down the bucket, so that you can't blame the courts there. But even other important constitutional bench cases have been pending for a long time. And my
Absolutely.
sense is the more you wait with hope, the more such cases will keep accumulating, at least in the next few years.
Yeah. In fact, I think this is what Gautam calls decision by indecision, right? Because you create sort of a fait accompli situation
I would say
when you
something
don't
else. I
decide.
would say why have hope in the courts in the first place? If Anyway, I mean, we can possibly go beyond that discussion. But
Yeah.
but I agree with you partially that in terms of demonstrating the basic minimum standards of independence, possibly some of the high court judges in the southern states have been a bit more forthright than their colleagues in. I mean, I'm generalizing, but definitely when you look at some orders from the Madras High Court or the Bombay High Court,
Yeah.
and even trial judges.
Karnataka High Court as well
Actually
in the
been
last year, I
actually
think.
far more prompt and far more fair in the way in which they have looked at many of these cases of unjust detentions, especially under Section 269 and 270,
Yes.
because those were the sections which have been used in most cases.
Yeah. Including the Tablighi Jamaat cases. I think the Bombay High Court had a very strong set of orders that have come out over the last couple
The
of
bench in
months.
Aurangabad, which
Yeah.
probably made the right decision for
Yeah.
us. So there's hope, but the question is, the world doesn't rest on hope. The world, you need more empirical evidence to first establish a claim.
So I think on that somber note, we will pause and Vanshika, if you want to, move into the more interactive part of this.
Sure. So we have good 10-15 minutes for questions. So any questions, if you could write them in the chat box, or if you would like to raise your hand, and we have enough time for you to go into a discussion. Any raised hands? So while people might be taking the time to write or raise their hands, can I go ahead and ask a question?
Sure.
So I saw both of you use this term called legislative process. And I'm coming obviously not with any background in law, but a very basic understanding that, well, when you say the word legislative process, for the longest time, it had an efficacy of its own, it had a value of its own, and it didn't have to be qualified, right? It was a taken for granted standard for me. And but just as Siddharth started with, quoting Agamben and talking about the conflation between, say, the state of exception and, the exception becoming the norm, I'm wondering if there is some way in which these understandings that have been taken for granted in law, such as, say, a legislative process, need to come out more within the domain of public scholarship. Because, I mean, just as you very briefly mentioned the world of fake news, there is a world out there that is shaping up where these processes are not being taken for the efficacy value that they had once. That they need to be qualified. That we are in a world at this point in time where legislative processes may not mean anything unless qualified, because well, you have someone who's telling them that I'm here to offer you my best of governance, and I'm here to look after you, no matter how horrible that ethic of care may be. So where do you, as legal scholars and lawyers, see the role of public scholarship in a time like this?
Yeah. So on the question of legislative process, actually there is this fascinating book by Shubhankar Dham, which looks at how ordinances in India have been made in the last 70 years. I mean, not 70. The book came 3 or 4 years ago, and he actually empirically demonstrates that the amount of lawmaking that happens through the ordinance route, which is basically the executive branch making up a legislation but not seeking a vote on parliament, then the parliamentary approval happens later, has actually been used more often than regular legislation. So I think it's interesting that you brought up this point, because you were possibly talking about the fact that the government has chosen not to have these bills debated in the way that most legislations have been, at least in the last 25 years. But actually, if you look at the evidence over 70 years, one can actually agree with your premise that the process was not taken seriously even in the past, or has not even been taken seriously on most issues. But that's an aside. I mean, that's moving away from the crux of what we are talking about right now. But even with this year's examples, for instance, we mentioned that the farm bills were initially brought as ordinances. And then the government simply uses its numbers in the Lok Sabha to pass it without discussion. And in Rajya Sabha, of course, we know that there was a confrontation. So on the larger cultural point of whether many voters now think that legislative debate or discussion is irrelevant, I guess there are two levels to it. One is the educative level, because if you simply disseminate the fact that this is the ordinary process of lawmaking, which is not simply a product of the Indian Constitution, but in fact was there even in the British-controlled legislatures 200 years ago. So you are effectively accepting a solution which is backsliding from what was the norm, even in the colonial legislatures. Even in the colonial legislatures, you would have an executive member first presenting a bill, asking the opposition members to comment on it. In some cases, being proactive and reaching out to civil society leaders. I mean, that's happened in colonial Bengal and colonial Bombay and colonial Madras. So how many of us are really comfortable with this idea that the level of parliamentary debate that should happen now should basically be worse than what happened even before Mr. Ram Manohar Roy was active? So I think you're right, we have to break the proposition down to simpler terms. We have to demystify processes. So the educative dimension is one part of it. The other part of it is, I guess, the harder part, which is what happens when educated people also don't care about civic solidarity or formal constitutional processes. And I guess that's the real challenge that we are facing on a day-to-day basis with our WhatsApp forwards, and especially with relatives who have very strong opinions about our current leadership. So I guess the only answer to that is that we've had propagandists getting away with this in the past. And it's quite a tragedy that some propagandists are getting away with it in our country right now. So we just have to be strategic and creative in terms of how we can point out the flaws or problems. But the question is, then is this culture going to change over time? I mean, that's an open question. I don't think I'm in a position to answer. Yeah. You're right. I mean, you will meet several people with a lot of life experience, with a lot of success in their careers, who are now actually rooting for leadership that doesn't discuss or doesn't deliberate. So forget about the ethic of care. Even the procedural norms of parliamentary democracy don't appear to be important to a certain section of voters.
I think it's also actually. I think it's very interesting to see how much of that applies even in civil society. Like since that is our broader theme for Dodin as well. I just want to sort of recall a short anecdote from recently. So in August, at the end of August this year, the Supreme Court passed an order in a PIL, and that has been the subject of a lot of public debate and discussion. So I won't go into the details. But in short, the PIL, the order of the Supreme Court directed the eviction of a large number of slum households along the railway tracks in Delhi. At that time, there was a sort of coalition of civil society and other activists who sort of came together with affected residents in these areas to sort of give for a policy and advocacy response to this. And I remember one of the earlier sort of emails that was circulating at that point of time had on its list of demands that the government should bring an ordinance to halt this decision. And I wrote back on that thread. And then, I mean, I did get, and I several responses agreeing with me on the point. And I wrote back saying that, ordinances are fundamentally an anti-democratic exercise. And as civil society, we should ideally be the last people pushing for these kind of measures. And several people did agree with it. And that demand was eventually dropped because the truncated parliament session convened the following week. And the matter did come up for a very brief discussion there. But the point I'm trying to make is, I think what Siddharth was saying is that decades of this happening, I think, have also tended to normalize some of these things in our heads, right? And whether as individuals, whether as academia, whether as civil society, I think there is always that risk of slipping into the narrative, right? And sort of normalizing.
Manish, I think the question
has come to be
broader. I think Manish, the question is not just ordinances being issued by faceless bureaucrats who are responding to day-to-day problems. I think here the question is faith in a leadership which makes it so strong, which is so strong that ordinary discussion, deliberation, cost-benefit analysis, all of these terms are being made irrelevant. That all that matters is sentiment or faith in what somebody can do. And when you have an incumbent government like that, I mean, then what does civil society say in response to that? I mean, if civil society calling for reason is enough for you to have UAPA cases filed against the most well-known scholars or intellectuals of the country, and for the best ones to migrate, then what other alternatives do we have? I think that's the deeper question.
It's true. Although I think, that is definitely sort of, the subject of
a larger crisis of law, right? It's a crisis of how culturally we create knowledge and culturally we accept certain terms as normal. So it's a much deeper problem.
Yeah.
Right. So we are just in time for closing comments from both of you. So whoever would want to go first.
So I think I've already kind of outlined what I had to say, but I mean, one thread that I was just trying to convey was that sometimes an exceptional situation or an emergent situation concentrates our attention on a set of problems because of the immediacy, right, or the impact that we see. But much of what has happened this year, either in terms of the failure to protect the migrant workers or the certain impulsiveness of the decision making, as I said, is something that could have been predicted at a certain cultural level. And when it comes to the neglect of the parliamentary process or the fact that administrative discretion was abused in such a manner, I think we have to look at it in a more structural way, because obviously those who are doing on-field reporting, those who are directly affected by the suffering, are more likely to first speak in that register. And many people, I know that even Anant was also personally involved, but many others all over the country have tried to at least do their bit in terms of providing social security assistance at whatever personal level they could. But obviously it is visible, I think, to everyone that civil society can't take the place of a rigorous state intervention. And here we have a dual problem. It wasn't just the incapacity or the limited nature of the state, which was a problem that we are dealing with here. It's also a state which uses this particular year to settle other scores, to pick up on other conflicts which have been going on for a while. So whether or not future governments are likely to behave in the same way or not, may be a product of many factors. I mean, mass education is one. The state of our electoral politics is another. And to be honest, the law has very little to do with those processes. I mean, the legal instruments of power, whether it is an ordinance, whether it is a legislation, or for that, I mean, my friend Manish is still very hopeful about the judiciary. But even if you look at judicial power, ultimately it is a subset of a certain category of bureaucratic power. So those of us who study law often take the judges too seriously. But if we locate it in, let's say, our understanding of how the state affects ordinary citizens, The judges are, for that matter, just another class of bureaucrats. And this phase has actually showed us how inefficient or how ineffective they have been. Because it's simply being asked to do when they were asked to do their job of listening to habeas corpus petitions, ensuring a smooth transition to online hearings. Even if they couldn't perform their basic functions, then what hope do you have about them performing a counter-majoritarian role or standing up to an authoritarian government, whether at the state or the central level? I think those were most of the issues that we've tried to touch on. And obviously, I mean, each of these issues can be unpacked into separate threads.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree. I mean, I agree with what Siddharth has said. And the fact, I think, going back to our initial invocation of Agamben and how I think that is something that we need to, that is something I think that we will have to be the most vigilant about, right? So as I just like just to quote Yuval Noah Harari, said short term, he said of the pandemic in general globally, he said the storm will pass, humankind will survive. Most of us will still be alive, but we will inhabit a different world. Many short-term emergency measures will become a fixture of life. That is the nature of emergencies. They fast forward historical processes. And I think that is, I think, what we need to be substantially cognizant about, that we're in the middle of that kind of an emergency. We're in the middle of that fast forwarding of that process. And I think I think being cognizant itself is important, because if we retain awareness about where we are in the processes that we're undergoing, then maybe on the other side, we will be able to find ways of dealing with them.
Thanks, Manish. Thank you, Siddharth. With this, we're wrapping up this session. We'll have about 30 minutes of a break, and we meet at 6 p.m. again for a poetry session by Gohar sir. So I hope I'll see everyone at the session at 6 p.m. This is a poetry session. Thank you once again for everyone for joining in for this session.
Yeah, and thanks for setting this up.
Thank you.